A kind waitress paid for a lonely Hell's Angels coffee, never imagining he was a billionaire. The aroma of stale coffee and sizzling bacon clung to the air of the Rusty Spoon diner like an enduring memory. It was perpetually dim inside, even with the weak morning sun struggling to penetrate the grimy windows that overlooked a bustling, indifferent city street. The Formica countertops bore the scars of countless elbows and spilled drinks, and the red vinyl booths, patched with electrical tape in places, sagged with a comfortable weariness. Every clatter of a plate, every hiss from the ancient espresso machine, every murmur of conversation, contributed to the diner's unique, melancholic symphony. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where regulars sought solace in routine, and strangers found brief, anonymous respite. The clock on the wall, its hands perpetually stuck at 5 past noon, was a fitting emblem for a place that existed slightly outside the relentless march of hours. Sarah, however, was acutely aware of every ticking second. Her shift had started before dawn, and the exhaustion was already a dull ache behind her eyes, a familiar companion. At 28, with lines of worry already etched faintly around her mouth, she carried the weight of a single mother trying to make ends meet in a city that demanded everything and gave little back. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back in a neat ponytail, had a few rebellious strands escaping, framing a face that, despite its tiredness, held a striking kindness. Her uniform, a simple apron over a pale blue shirt, was impeccably clean, a small rebellion against the grime of her surroundings and the chaos of her personal life. She moved with an efficient grace, refilling coffee cups, wiping down tables, her movements ingrained and automatic, a dance perfected over years of necessity. Each tray carried, each order taken, was a step towards tonight's dinner, tomorrow's rent, the school trip her son, Leo, so desperately wanted to go on. The early morning rush had tapered off, leaving behind a scattering of lone diners nursing lukewarm coffee and the ghosts of hurried breakfasts. Sarah welcomed the lull. It gave her a moment to breathe, to let her mind drift from the incessant demands of her job to the quieter anxieties of her home life. Leo's cough had seemed worse last night, a dry, persistent hack that rattled her nerves. She'd checked his forehead countless times, her palm a makeshift thermometer, praying it wasn't anything serious, that she wouldn't have to miss a shift, that she wouldn't have to dip into the meager emergency fund that was meant for truly dire circumstances. The thought of medical bills sent a familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She loved her job, truly, for the fleeting connections it offered, the small acts of service, the sense of purpose it provided, but the relentless financial pressure was a constant, heavy shroud over her life. She often wondered if she was doing enough, if she was failing Leo in some fundamental way by always being so tired, so preoccupied. A sigh escaped her lips, barely audible above the low hum of the refrigeration unit. The jingle of the bell above the entrance, usually a gentle announcement, sounded like a jarring clang this particular morning. All conversation in the diner seemed to halt, a collective intake of breath. Sarah, wiping down the counter near the pie display, instinctively looked up. Standing in the doorway, framed against the muted light of the street, was a figure that commanded attention, an undeniable presence that seemed to absorb all sound. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and undeniably formidable, clad head to toe in worn, black leather. A heavy, patched vest, adorned with various insignia and the infamous death head emblem, covered a denim shirt. His arms, visible beneath rolled-up sleeves, were a canvas of intricate, faded tattoos, twisting dragons and skulls interwoven with indecipherable script. A thick, grizzled beard, streaked with gray, framed a face that was weathered and stern, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a dark bandana. His boots, heavy and scuffed, made a deliberate thud with each step as he moved into the diner, a palpable ripple of unease spreading through the handful of patrons. Outside, parked conspicuously at the curb, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, gleaming despite its age, sat like a steel beast, its presence a silent declaration. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinctive flutter of apprehension that most people felt in the presence of someone so overtly intimidating. She had seen her share of rough characters pass through the Rusty Spoon's doors over the years, bikers, truckers, late-night revelers, but this man exuded a different kind of authority, a quiet, almost dangerous gravitas. Yet, her training and her innate resilience kicked in. Every customer, no matter how imposing, deserved the same courtesy. She took a deep breath, smoothing her apron, and offered a small, professional smile. The man, seemingly oblivious to the sudden silence he had created, walked past the occupied booths, his gaze sweeping over the room with an unnerving intensity before settling on a secluded booth at the very back, tucked away in a corner, almost out of sight. It was a strategic choice, a place where he could observe without being too observed, or perhaps, a place where he simply sought solitude. He slid into the booth with surprising grace for a man of his size, his leather jacket creaking softly. He didn't remove his bandana or his vest, remaining fully armored, a stark contrast to the casual comfort of the diner. Sarah approached his table, her pad and pen ready, her smile unwavering, albeit a little tighter than usual. "Welcome to the Rusty Spoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "What can I get for you this morning?" The man looked up, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers. They were a piercing blue, startlingly bright against his weathered skin, and held an unexpected depth, a weariness that belied the sternness of his expression. He didn't speak immediately, simply studying her for a beat, an unnerving silence hanging between them. Sarah resisted the urge to shift her weight or break eye contact. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited trouble. Finally, his voice, a low rumble, broke the silence. "Just a coffee. Black." His tone was gruff, devoid of pleasantries, yet not unkind. It was simply, direct. "Coming right up," Sarah replied, turning on her heel, a small measure of relief washing over her. A simple order, a simple interaction. Nothing out of the ordinary, despite the extraordinary presence. As she poured a fresh cup of the diner's perpetually brewing dark roast, Sarah found her gaze drifting back to the man. He hadn't pulled out a phone, hadn't opened a newspaper. He just sat there, his large hands resting on the table, seemingly lost in thought, staring out of the window at nothing in particular. The rigid posture, the imposing attire, all of it seemed to melt away slightly as she watched him. There was a profound sense of solitude about him, an almost palpable loneliness that radiated from his corner booth. It wasn't the aggressive, defiant isolation she might have expected from someone of his appearance, it was a quieter, more introspective kind of aloneness. He took a slow sip of his coffee when she placed it before him, a faint sigh escaping his lips. He didn't offer a thank you this time, but his eyes, when they briefly flickered up to hers, held a fleeting, almost imperceptible softening. It was enough for Sarah, a silent acknowledgement that transcended words. She left him to his thoughts, returning to refill other customers' cups, but her mind kept returning to the man in the corner. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. The man remained in his booth, nursing his coffee, occasionally running a calloused thumb over the rim of the mug. He seemed utterly oblivious to the world around him, lost in a private contemplation. Sarah noticed the way he held himself, not with arrogance, but with a kind of worn-out dignity. There was something in his stillness, in the profound quietness he exuded, that touched a chord deep within her. Perhaps it was the echo of her own weariness, her own moments of feeling utterly alone amidst the clamor of life. Or perhaps it was simply her innate kindness, that stubborn refusal to let the harshness of the world harden her heart completely. She looked at the check she had already prepared for him, a paltry sum for a single cup of coffee. It was her own financial struggles that made the decision even more significant, but in that moment, she didn't hesitate. A small, impulsive thought bloomed in her mind: he looks like he could use a break. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulled out a few crumpled dollars, and slid them discreetly under the check on her tray. With a deep breath, Sarah walked back to his table. She placed the check, now with her own money tucked beneath it, gently beside his coffee cup. He didn't immediately look up. "Your check, sir," she said softly, her voice low so as not to draw attention. He finally lifted his head, those piercing blue eyes meeting hers again. He picked up the small slip of paper, his large fingers carefully unfolding it. As he saw the money, a sudden, almost imperceptible furrow appeared on his brow. He looked from the dollars to her face, a flicker of surprise, then confusion, crossing his features. "What's this?" he rumbled, his voice a little less gruff this time, tinged with genuine curiosity. Sarah offered a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it, sir. It's on me today. Just a little something from the Rusty Spoon." She didn't elaborate, didn't offer pity, just a simple, genuine gesture. She saw his eyes search hers, as if trying to decipher her true intentions, probing for an ulterior motive that wasn't there. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then paused, the words unspoken. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant clatter from the kitchen. The man slowly, almost deliberately, pushed the money back towards her. "No," he said, his voice firm, but with a softened edge. "I can pay for my own coffee." Sarah gently pushed the money back. "It's really no trouble, sir. Please, just consider it a small gesture." She held his gaze, her sincerity evident. After another moment of contemplation, a barely perceptible nod, a slight dip of his head, was his only acknowledgement. He didn't thank her verbally this time, but the stark blue of his eyes seemed to hold a different light, a moment of profound, quiet acceptance. He rose from the booth, his movements slow and deliberate, the leather of his vest creaking with the shift of his powerful frame. Without another word, he turned and walked towards the exit, his heavy boots echoing softly on the worn linoleum floor. The bell above the door jingled once more as he stepped out into the morning light, disappearing as quickly and enigmatically as he had arrived. Sarah watched him go, then turned back to clear his table, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. She thought nothing more of it. Just a small kindness, a fleeting interaction in the endless parade of faces that passed through her diner every day. The world kept spinning, bills still needed to be paid, and Leo would be home from school soon. The memory of the gruff biker and his piercing blue eyes would likely fade by the next shift. The faint, almost imperceptible smile that had briefly touched Sarah's lips evaporated as she turned from the empty booth. The lingering aroma of stale coffee and disinfectant filled the void left by the biker's departure, and her mind, ever practical, quickly reeled back to the pressing realities of her day. The small act of kindness, a fleeting indulgence, was already receding into the background, overshadowed by the relentless drumbeat of financial anxiety. She cleared the table, wiping down the formica with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic, her thoughts a tangled knot of worries. Bills, Leo's cough, the ever-present threat of an empty refrigerator, these were the constants, the heavy anchors in her life. The gruff man in leather was just another face, another brief interaction in the endless procession. That night, Leo's cough was indeed worse. It was a hacking, rattling sound that tore at Sarah's heart, keeping her awake long after the city outside had quieted. She held him close, stroking his forehead, feeling the faint warmth that suggested a fever was brewing. Every dry, rasping breath from her son sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She tried all the home remedies, warm tea with honey, a steamy bathroom, extra blankets. Nothing seemed to suit the persistent irritation in his small chest. The image of a doctor's visit, the inevitable copay, the prescription costs, flashed through her mind, a cold dread tightening its grip. Her meager emergency fund, carefully hoarded for truly desperate situations, felt impossibly small against the looming expenses. Sleep offered no respite, only fragmented dreams filled with the sound of Leo's labored breathing and the relentless clatter of plates. The next morning, the exhaustion was no longer a dull ache, it was a throbbing symphony behind her eyes, a leaden weight in her limbs. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness of her apartment like a ghost, preparing Leo's toast and juice, her own appetite long gone. He was pale, his eyes heavy-lidded, and he picked at his food without enthusiasm. "Mommy, my throat hurts," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sarah knelt beside him, brushing his hair from his forehead. "I know, baby. Just a little more tea, okay? It'll help." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. She knew he needed more than tea. She needed to take him to the clinic, but the thought of missing another shift, of losing a day's wages, was a terrifying prospect. The rent was due next week, and the school trip, once a distant dream, now felt like an impossible fantasy, a luxury she couldn't even begin to consider. At the Rusty Spoon, the aroma of stale coffee and sizzling bacon was a familiar comfort, but today it felt like a suffocating blanket. Sarah poured coffee, wiped counters, and took orders, her professional smile stretched thin, her movements lacking their usual efficient grace. Her mind was a million miles away, replaying Leo's cough, calculating dwindling funds, and battling the gnawing guilt of a mother who felt she was failing. She missed an order, spilled a splash of coffee, and had to apologize twice to a regular. Her manager, a gruff but understanding woman named Brenda, noticed. "Everything all right, sweetie?" Brenda asked, her voice softer than usual. Sarah just nodded, unable to articulate the depth of her despair without breaking down. "Just a long night," she mumbled, turning away to hide the tremor in her hands. The morning rush, usually a welcome distraction, felt like an endless gauntlet of demands. Each request for a refill, each specific order, pulled at her frayed nerves. She felt brittle, on the verge of shattering. The familiar faces of the regulars, usually a source of small comfort, seemed to blur into an indistinguishable mass. She longed for the lull, the quiet moments when she could simply breathe, but even then, the silence would only amplify the frantic whispers of her worries. She felt trapped, caught in a relentless cycle of work and worry, with no apparent escape. The world outside the diner's grimy windows seemed indifferent to her plight, the bustling city streets a constant reminder of a life she couldn't afford. Then, the bell above the entrance jingled. It wasn't the jarring clang of 2 days prior, but a softer, almost anticipated sound. Sarah didn't look up immediately. Her focus was on wiping down the counter near the pie display, her back to the door, her mind still consumed by Leo's feverish brow. She heard the familiar heavy thud of boots on the worn linoleum, felt the subtle shift in the diner's atmosphere, a slight hush falling over the remaining patrons. It was him. The Hell's Angel. Her heart gave a tiny, involuntary lurch, not of fear this time, but of a strange, unbidden curiosity. Why was he back? She took a steadying breath, preparing herself for another gruff, solitary interaction. He didn't make a sound as he passed the occupied booths, his gaze sweeping the room with the same unnerving intensity as before, yet today there was a subtle difference. His eyes, though still hidden mostly beneath the brim of his dark bandana, seemed to linger more, to observe with a deeper purpose. He walked directly to the secluded booth at the back, the same one he had occupied previously, and slid into it with the same surprising grace. His leather jacket creaked softly. He didn't remove his bandana or his vest, remaining fully armored, a stark, imposing figure in the dim corner. But this time, his gaze didn't drift out the window. It settled, with an almost unnerving persistence, on Sarah. He watched her as she moved, refilling coffee, wiping tables, his piercing blue eyes tracking her every weary movement. Sarah finally turned, her tray in hand, her professional smile automatically in place, though it felt like a heavy mask. She approached his table, her pad and pen ready, her voice, despite her exhaustion, steady. "Welcome back to the Rusty Spoon, sir." "Just a coffee, black, again?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light, though her mind was still wrestling with Leo's cough. He looked up, and his piercing blue eyes met hers. They were just as startlingly bright against his weathered skin, but today, they held a new depth, a knowing glint that unsettled her. He didn't speak immediately, just studied her face, taking in the faint lines of worry, the slight tremor in her hands as she held the pad. "Yes," he rumbled, his voice a low growl, but with a hint of something more, a subtle inflection she couldn't quite place. "And a moment of your time, if you have it." Sarah blinked, surprised by the request. It wasn't typical. Most of the diner's patrons sought only food and anonymity. "Of course, sir," she replied, though a ripple of apprehension now ran through her. What could he possibly want? She turned to pour his coffee, her mind racing, trying to anticipate his next move. As she placed the steaming mug before him, his large hand, calloused and scarred, reached out, not for the cup, but for something else. He placed a small, folded piece of paper on the table, pushing it gently towards her. It wasn't a check, nor a tip. It was a crisp, white envelope, sealed, with her name, Sarah, scrawled across the front in a surprisingly elegant hand. Sarah looked from the envelope to his face, her brow furrowed in confusion. What is this, sir?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His blue eyes, usually so stern, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, concern? Pity? He offered no explanation, simply pushed the envelope a little closer. "Open it," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, almost a command, yet laced with an unexpected gentleness. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding a strange rhythm against her ribs. She picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly, and carefully broke the seal. Inside, nestled amongst several crisp $100 bills, was a single, elegantly written note. Her eyes scanned the words, and a gasp escaped her lips, a sound barely audible above the low hum of the refrigeration unit, but it was enough to draw the attention of the few remaining patrons. The note was brief, almost curt, but its message was clear, and it spoke directly to her deepest, most urgent fears. It was a promise, a lifeline, and a mystery all at once. The biker watched her, his expression unreadable, waiting. He had set a stone in motion, and the ripples were just beginning to spread through Sarah's carefully constructed, fragile world. Sarah's fingers trembled as she pulled the note free, her eyes darting over the elegant script. It read, "Your kindness is a rare commodity in this world. Use this to care for Leo. A small token of gratitude from a grateful soul." Beneath the words, nestled amongst the $100 bills, was a smaller, separate slip with a phone number and the name, Dr. Evans, pediatric specialist. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She fanned out the money, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. $10, $20, $30, $100 bills. $3,000. $3,000, an amount that felt like a king's ransom, an impossible dream. The note, the money, the doctor's contact, it wasn't just a random act of charity, it was targeted, specific, almost as if he knew. Knew about Leo's cough, knew about her struggles. A wave of dizzying disbelief washed over her, followed by a surge of raw, overwhelming emotion. Her eyes welled up, blurring the lines of the note, and a single tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her tired cheek. This wasn't just money, it was hope. It was a reprieve. It was a lifeline thrown from the most unexpected of sources. She looked up, her gaze sweeping towards the door, but the biker was long gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of leather and a profound silence. The few remaining patrons, drawn by her gasp, now watched her with curious, questioning eyes. Brenda, her manager, approached, a worried frown on her face. "Sarah? What's wrong, honey? Is everything okay?" Sarah quickly folded the money and the note, tucking them back into the envelope and then deep into the pocket of her apron, a secret too precious and fragile to share just yet. She forced a shaky smile. "Nothing, Brenda. Everything's fine. Just, a really generous tip." Brenda eyed her skeptically, but the diner was calling, and she turned back to her duties, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her unbelievable fortune. Sarah's hands were still trembling as she cleared the biker's table, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and gratitude. Who was this man? How did he know about Leo? The details didn't matter right now. What mattered was the immediate, tangible relief that flooded her entire being. As soon as her shift ended, Sarah rushed home, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a frantic energy. Leo was still pale, his cough still rattling his small frame. Guided by the note, Sarah called the number for Dr. Evans. To her surprise, the receptionist was incredibly accommodating, fitting Leo in for an emergency appointment that very afternoon. It was as if a path had been cleared for her, obstacles removed by an unseen hand. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes, examined Leo thoroughly. It was bronchitis, severe enough to warrant antibiotics and a nebulizer. The cost, which would have sent Sarah into a spiral of despair just hours earlier, was now merely a transaction. She paid for the medication, her heart swelling with gratitude, watching the relief wash over Leo's face as the first dose began its work. Over the next few days, Leo improved dramatically. The cough subsided, his color returned, and his infectious giggle once again filled their small apartment. Sarah watched him play, her heart lighter than it had been in years, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The $3,000, while not an endless sum, was a powerful buffer. She paid the rent with money to spare, bought groceries without having to scrutinize every price tag, and even managed to put aside a portion for Leo's school trip, a dream that now felt wonderfully within reach. The gnawing dread that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady hope. She never saw the biker again at the Rusty Spoon. He remained an enigma, a shadowy figure who had appeared like a guardian angel and vanished just as swiftly. Sarah often wondered about him, about the piercing blue eyes that held such unexpected depth, about the quiet loneliness that had radiated from him. She knew, deep in her heart, that it wasn't just a generous tip. It was an act of profound, almost mystical kindness, a response to her own small gesture of compassion. That single cup of coffee, paid for out of her own meager funds, had somehow unlocked a hidden wellspring of benevolence. What Sarah didn't know was the true identity of the man in black leather. His name was Arthur Vance, and he was indeed a billionaire, a reclusive titan of industry who had built his empire from nothing, rising from a childhood of poverty and neglect. He had found solace and a sense of belonging in the brotherhood of the Hells Angels, a stark contrast to the sterile, cutthroat world of high finance. Arthur had a habit of, every so often, shedding his corporate persona, donning his leathers, and riding his Harley-Davidson across the country, seeking out places where genuine human connection still existed, where kindness wasn't a commodity. He often sought out diners, places where he could observe people, unburdened by the weight of his wealth. He had an uncanny ability to spot true character, to see beyond appearances. When Sarah had paid for his coffee, it wasn't just the money that resonated with him. It was the quiet dignity in her tired eyes, the faint lines of worry that spoke of a struggle she carried alone, and yet, she still offered a selfless act of generosity to a stranger who, to all outward appearances, seemed perfectly capable of paying for himself. She hadn't sought recognition or gratitude, she had simply acted from a place of pure, unadulterated empathy. It reminded him of his own mother, a woman who had given everything despite having nothing. He had seen her struggle, observed her quiet desperation, and understood the weight she carried. The pediatric specialist's contact information came from his own network, a quick phone call from a burner phone, a brief explanation of the situation, and the doctor was ready to assist. Arthur Vance believed that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in the power to alleviate suffering, to offer a hand up to those who genuinely deserved it. He preferred to be the anonymous benefactor, the unseen force, watching the ripples of kindness spread. Life at the Rusty Spoon continued its familiar rhythm, the aroma of stale coffee and sizzling bacon a constant presence. Sarah still worked her shifts, still refilled coffee cups and wiped down tables, but there was a new lightness in her step, a brighter glint in her kind eyes. The exhaustion was still there, a part of her daily reality, but the heavy shroud of financial dread had lifted. She could now breathe a little easier, knowing that Leo was healthy, that the rent was paid, and that her son's school trip was no longer an impossible dream. She often caught herself smiling, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. She never told anyone about the biker, about the envelope, about the anonymous gift that had changed everything. It was her secret, a quiet miracle, a testament to the unexpected power of a simple act of human kindness. She learned to embrace the fleeting connections her job offered, cherishing each one, understanding that even the smallest gesture could have profound, unforeseen consequences. The world, she realized, was full of hidden depths, of quiet heroes, and of the most extraordinary acts of generosity, often disguised in the unlikeliest of forms. And sometimes, all it took was a single cup of coffee to change a life.